Today, I want to talk about the emotional craft of fiction uh, as a more general way to discuss how you can bring more emotion into your writing. Emotion is very important. This book here is a writing guide by Donald Maass, and I think gives a really good insight into how to do this in your fiction writing. So, as Maass himself says, many writers have really interesting lives. They have had to overcome all sorts of difficulties and obstacles to get where they are. And nevertheless, many writers just write really emotionally flat, uninteresting characters with everyday lives. And they just, even though they have lots of personal experience to draw from, you might wonder why do they do that? And he says maybe it's because writing emotion into your novel is difficult or into your short story. So I'll just talk about a few points that he makes that I think are really useful. But I do recommend, if you want to get more into how to put emotion into your book, this is really highly recommended. So, Maass uses cognitive science and just his insights as a literary agent to argue that many people ask the wrong question. When they start out writing, they wonder, well, should I show or tell? And very often it's said that telling is better, that showing is better than telling, so that you evoke a sense of emotion in the reader, not by saying what the emotion is, but by conveying it through context, through milieu, and so on. He says, well, the most useful question is not, how can I get across what characters are going through? The better question is, how can I get readers to go on an emotional journey on their own? And that is the important thing. So the important thing is not what are your characters feeling, although obviously that's going to be relevant in what your reader is feeling. What is relevant is what your reader is going to feel. And as he says, as a literary agent, he gets through the slush pile, the sort of the manuscripts that come on his desk. Many manuscripts, he says, provoke very little feeling at all. So why is that? Now, Maass draws a distinction between three kinds of evoking emotion. The first mode is the mode you may be most familiar with, which is outer mode or showing, which is basically you, for instance, you want to evoke the feeling of fear. So what do? Obviously, you don't say her guts clenched in fear, because that doesn't do anything. It doesn't make you fearful. Rather, you describe a spooky situation, and that way you evoke fear indirectly into the reader. So that's outer mode or showing. And then you have inner mode or telling. Now you might think, well, telling doesn't work. And very often it doesn't, because if you say, oh, I feel so very sad today, you're not necessarily going to get that feeling evoked in the reader. So how come? Well, very often, so there's several things you can do. You can try to avoid cliches such as his guts twisted in fear, or her eyes shot daggers at him. As Maass says, well, you don't feel the simmering rage because the daggers have dulled. So you need to find something fresh, something non-obvious. If you use inner mode and you describe what the character is feeling, it's very often more effective to not take the primary feeling, but a sort of secondary, less obvious feeling. And that way you get to the primary feeling. So for example, so he gives as a writing exercise, suppose that you have a place where your protagonist feels something strongly, and then identify that feeling. So for example, let's say the protagonist feels fear, but maybe the protagonist also feels something else. And then you can take that less obvious feeling and you can get from that feeling to get your reader to feel the feeling of fear. Now, as he says, you also have to keep in mind, why do people read? Well, people read because they want an experience. Now, that might sound simplistic, but people want they want enjoyment, suspense, amusement. What psychologists call belief affirmation. So people like to be challenged, and people like to feel something about themselves. So you want to help your reader along doing this. You want to keep them guessing, not too much obviously. I mean, they still have to know where it's going, But you have to keep in mind not just what your protagonist is feeling, but also what your reader might be experiencing, feeling when they read your story. So you could do that, for example, as he goes on here, with small details, small situations that evoke a situation that is already preloaded with feeling. And I'll go to an example where he looks at this in detail in a moment. And that way you evoke that experience in the reader. Now, how do you stir something like higher emotions? He says, it's disappointing that so many characters I meet in manuscripts are pretty ordinary in their makeup. Why would you create characters who only raise shrugs? And then he draws on research by Jonathan Haidt and others who say that fiction can have an effect that is called moral elevation, which is a feeling where we see something in a story and it causes us to want to be better ourselves. We make better choices when characters inspire us to do so. So, for example, taking a stand for what's right is something that can get that. And he doesn't mean with that you necessarily have characters who are, completely wonderful and saintly, super saintly people, as Susan Wolf has argued, are just boring. But on the other hand, as a writer, you have to resist the idea like, okay, I'm going to create a great character, and that's fine, but you have to wonder, like, why am I doing this? What sort of facets does the character have? Is the character not just going to be boring? So you have to raise what he calls the moral stakes of the situation. Now, how do you signal to a reader that a character is good? There's a really easy method, which is called the save the cat method, where the character shows sort of details, small things of worthiness, like, for example, saving the cat or giving money to a homeless person. And that way you signal early on to your reader, and it's a good thing to do this early on, that your character is morally good, or at any rate capable of doing moral good. Because that's another thing that Maass says, it is really powerful that you have a character who's morally ambiguous and you want them to be good. So I'm now watching this series called Cobra Kai, and you have this jaded karate teacher, and at least, in the early episodes of this series, I kind of feel like I want this guy to become a better person. I see something good in him. I want him to become a better person. And I think that the series does have its appeal in part from this sense of moral stakes. So how do you hook the reader emotionally? Here is an example that Maass looks at, namely the beginning of the Hunger Games. So The Hunger Games is this dystopian novel about this young woman who plays in games organized by local governments to, where people compete to the death. So here's just the opening lines, and we'll look in a moment at how this evokes emotion in the reader. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. So this is a very effective hook for the reader, because early on you signal a sense of goodness in the protagonist, because the protagonist wonders about, where's this person who's lying next to me in my bed? And you also notice that it must be her sister, maybe her younger sister. You also get the sense that they can't be very rich sleeping in a bed together. And you see the concern of the protagonist for the sister. Now, you hear this very intriguing, of course she did, this is the day of the reaping. And so as a reader, you're intrigued, you're puzzled, you wonder, reaping? What is that? So that's how this works. You up the moral stakes. You note that even though there is a sort of sense of foreboding, the author doesn't say, I felt this horrible sense of foreboding because this horrible reaping is going to happen. She doesn't say anything about that. She just says, my sister must be concerned about this day of the reaping. So you see how you sort of hold off, and this is a general technique that Maass recommends, Whenever there's something really emotional or big going on, you have to sort of draw back, take a step back, and focus on something smaller or secondary, which turns out to be much more effective. Okay, now, of course, in your novel, you will have what he calls high moments. And high moments are those that really stir people emotionally, such as forgiveness, sacrifice. Somebody sacrifice, and not just people sacrificing their lives, but also something smaller, like making material sacrifices for the well-being of their children. Betrayal is also very powerful. A moral dilemma that doesn't get resolved, or death. Death is quite interesting. You have to be careful with it, obviously. But he says sometimes, readers want a good cry. And the question, why do readers want to read about awful things, is just an interesting philosophical question. It's the paradox of tragedy, like why do we crave, why do we like things that are sad? And the way Maass puts it is nice. He says, sadness by itself is not a feeling we want, certainly, but sorrow is. Sorrow adds something to sadness. Sorrow happens when we have not only lost someone, but also missed them. Their absence isn't emptiness, which is violent, but a feeling of incompleteness. When death is sad, the door is closed. When death triggers sorrow, the door is still open. But to what? To something good that we don't want to give up, to the person we care about. The more we care, the greater our sorrow will be. So it's effective to have something really sad in the story if it evokes in the reader a kind of nostalgia or longing. Like, you don't want to crush them. You just want to evoke this sense which readers like. So there's lots and lots of useful tips. I really can't go into all of them. Just maybe one final tip that I found really interesting is that the tip of the emotional mirror. So obviously your characters are not you, but at the same time they come from your head. So in a sense they do reflect you. And how do you make authentic characters? Well, authentic characters take root, he says, when you get real with yourself. Be honest and empower yourself, and you'll be able to release all the authenticity and power in your fictional people. So you have to make your characters make choices that maybe aren't comfortable, but that authentically reflect what those characters would be. You could, for instance, this is a technique that many writing guides recommend, interrogate your character, like, what are you going to do next? What's up? And that way you get more authentic, honest characters, and it's a way of conveying honesty and fiction. So that's it. There's lots and lots of individual writing exercises that you can look at. He also finds it important to have a sense of hope throughout stories, because if you lose hope, this is also why, even if you have a story in which lots of bad things happen, the moment that too much badness happens, or there is just no glimmer of hope, you just start emotionally zoning out. So it's important to keep at least the reader rooting for your characters. Okay, that's it. Thank you.